The Sony a6400 is a pretty popular camera, so let's look at photos first. It has a APS-C size 24 megapixel sensor, which is pretty standard nowadays. But what is special is the fact that this camera does 11 frames per second, which is blazing fast. This is good enough for sports, dance, anything with a ton of action. And on top of that, it has a really fast autofocusing system, which is extremely reliable. The autofocusing system in this camera is literally set it and forget it. It has face tracking and object tracking and will track your subject within the frame. So it's actually hard to miss a shot with this camera. I will talk more about this autofocusing system later in this video, but for the time being, just know that it's spectacular. What makes this camera really special for photos is the 14-bit RAW codec. With 14-bit RAW, it really doesn't matter what brand I'm shooting. At this point, I can do anything that I want with my photos in Lightroom and Photoshop. You can easily deliver high-level results with this camera. Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, nothing about this camera when it comes to photos is really going to limit you. In my opinion, the Sony codecs have a little bit more latitude than the Canon codecs, but on top of that, the Sony cameras tend to stay very clean at high ISO. You could easily shoot this camera at 20,000 ISO and get very good results. The reason to get the Sony a6400 is really the video, because video is where this camera shines. The reason this camera is so interesting for video is because it was actually Sony's first camera that allowed you to do vlogging, because this camera actually has a flip-up screen so that you can see yourself. The person that I would probably recommend the a6400 to is someone that's doing travel videos and cinematic videos, someone that's maybe a wedding photographer, does interviews, live events, conferences, so we might as well talk about the specifications of this camera. It does 4K, which is actually subsampled from 6K, which means it has the detail of 6K, but in a more manageable 4K package, and it does up to 30 frames per second at 100 megabits per second bit rates. Also, in full HD, it does up to 120 frames per second, which is 5 times slow motion, with a max bit rate of 50 megabits per second. Also, if you're shooting wedding, conferences, interviews, something you should note is that this camera no longer has a record limit, which makes it really ideal for that type of shooting. Sony made sure that you got everything you could out of this camera by adding a ton of cinematic profiles. This camera has S-Log2, S-Log3, and Cinema Gamut 1 through 4. It's more so a camera that I would use for travel videos, shooting music festivals, concerts, just something where I had to run and gun and move really fast. And the main reason for that is, besides having a great sharp image with fantastic colors, this camera also has very fast autofocus even in video. When it comes to autofocus, this camera is extremely reliable. It is literally set it and forget it. With face tracking, I never have to worry about whether or not someone is in focus, if the camera's doing it right. It actually shows a little square around their face, and I know they're in focus. I know this camera's gonna track focus very smoothly. And this autofocus actually makes my job super easy when I'm doing any kind of camera movement or when I put the camera on a gimbal. Honestly, I think a Sony camera is worth buying simply for the autofocus. But what really makes a difference is the design of this camera. So, let's take a look at it. The thing that really stands out about this camera is the fact that it is so small and so compact. It honestly feels like I'm carrying around a small point and shoot, but it looks way better than a point and shoot ever could. When it comes to the actual build quality of this camera, it is phenomenal. It looks small, it looks plasticky, but I promise you, this camera is incredibly robust. You can easily drop it a few times. Please don't drop your camera. But this camera is built to last. But one thing that I do love about this camera is that the ergonomics are fantastic. All the buttons are exactly where they should be, and using this camera is pretty intuitive. If you're more of a pro or pretty serious photo shooter, I do recommend sticking with the a6400 simply because the body is much more robust, and that extra bit of durability is going to go a long way if you have this camera for 4 or 5 years. This is a great camera for anyone shooting interviews, weddings, real estate, conferences. Well guys, those are my thoughts on the Sony a6400.